Hey guys, welcome to The Quiet Past, historical channel. Tonight we're doing something a little different. The houses were made of sandstone blocks mortared together with mud, and the roofs were wooden beams covered with smaller sticks and more mud. Every morning, people would wake up when the sun hit the canyon wall just right. There were no alarm clocks, obviously, but the light would creep across the rock face in this slow, predictable way that told you what time it was better than any clock could. The women would grind corn on stone metates, this rhythmic scraping sound that probably became like white noise after a while. The kids would carry water up from the spring in ceramic pots their grandmothers had made. And here's the thing about these pots. They weren't just functional. People painted them with these geometric designs, black on white, that were honestly stunning. No one was making them to sell or show off. They were just making beautiful things, because why not make your water jug nice to look at? Every single pot was a little piece of art that someone used every single day until it broke. And then they'd make another one. A day in the life of absolutely nothing exciting. Let's follow a guy named, well, we don't know his name. The ancestral Puebloans didn't leave written records, so we'll just call him he who tends the corn, because that's probably what he spent most of his time doing. He who tends the corn would wake up in his cliff dwelling, which he shared with his wife, his 3 kids, his mother, and sometimes his brother's family when they were visiting. Privacy wasn't really a thing. The room was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with a fire pit in the center and sleeping mats arranged around the edges. There was a ventilation shaft cut into the rock to let the smoke out, which worked pretty well most of the time. Breakfast was probably leftover corn porridge from the night before, maybe with some dried berries mixed in if it was late summer. Then he'd head down the ladder, because these cliff dwellings were accessed by ladders that you could pull up at night, and make his way to the fields. The fields were down in the canyon bottom, where there was actually some soil and occasional water. The corn was planted in little hills with the beans and squash, and he who tends the corn would spend his morning checking each plant, pulling weeds, maybe shooing away a very optimistic rabbit. It wasn't exciting work. It was the kind of work where your mind wanders and you think about whether you should repair that crack in your roof, or if it'll hold another season, and whether your daughter is going to marry that boy from the next village over, and what you're going to dream about tonight. Around midday, when the sun was directly overhead and working outside was basically punishment, he'd head back up to the village. Lunch was more corn-based food, because that's what they had. Corn bread, corn porridge, corn kernels roasted and salted. Sometimes there was turkey, because they kept domesticated turkeys, though mostly for their feathers. The turkeys wandered around the village, making their weird gobbling sounds, and occasionally getting into the corn stores. Afternoons were for other work, maybe repairing tools or weaving, or working on that roof crack he'd been thinking about. The village had a kiva, which was this underground ceremonial room where the men would gather sometimes to talk and make decisions and perform rituals. But honestly, a lot of the time they were probably just hanging out down there because it was cool and quiet, and their wives were upstairs telling them to fix things. The art of doing nothing dramatically. What's striking about these villages is how little drama there seems to have been. Archaeologists have studied the remains extensively, and there's just not much evidence of violence. No mass graves, no weapon stockpiles, no defensive fortifications beyond the natural protection of living on a cliff. People seem to have just lived next to each other, year after year, in relative peace. Sure, there were probably arguments. Someone's turkey got into someone else's corn. Someone didn't do their fair share of maintaining the communal spaces. Someone's kid threw a rock at someone else's kid. But these were the kinds of conflicts that got resolved by the village elders sitting everyone down and talking it through until someone apologized or agreed to make restitution. The religious life of the village was woven into everything, but it wasn't the fire and brimstone kind of religion. It was more about maintaining balance and harmony with the natural world. There were ceremonies for planting and harvest, rituals to encourage rain, dances to celebrate the solstices. Everyone participated, from the smallest kids to the oldest grandparents. The ceremonies could last for days, with breaks for eating and sleeping, and they were as much social events as religious ones. Evenings were communal. As the sun set and the canyon walls turned red and gold, families would gather on the plaza in front of the cliff dwellings. The women would continue their work, weaving baskets or making pottery, while the men repaired tools or worked on larger construction projects. The kids would run around playing games that probably haven't changed much in 800 years, tag, basically, and throwing things, and pretending to be hunters or warriors, even though their actual village didn't have much use for warriors. Stories were huge. The old people would tell stories about the ancestors, about how the world was made, about the time someone's grandfather did something incredibly foolish with a bear. These stories weren't written down, so they had to be memorized and passed on exactly right, which meant the whole village knew them by heart. They were entertainment, sure, but they were also history and law and moral instruction, all rolled into one. The rhythm of season's winter in the canyon was quiet. The fields were empty, the corn stored in sealed rooms cut into the cliff face to keep it dry and away from mice. People stayed inside more, working on crafts, telling stories, sleeping a lot because there wasn't much else to do. The kiva was warmer than the living quarters, so people gathered there more often. Spring was planting time, which meant everyone was busy from dawn to dusk. The fields had to be prepared, the seeds planted at exactly the right time, prayers and offerings made to ensure a good harvest. It was exhausting work, but there was also this sense of hope and renewal. Everything was green, water was flowing in the canyon bottom, and the world felt full of possibility. Summer was maintenance, weeding, watering when possible, watching the sky for any sign of rain. The Southwest is a desert, and rain was never guaranteed. Some years it came right when it was needed. Some years it didn't come at all, and people had to dip into their stored reserves and hope next year would be better. But in this particular village, in this particular time period, things were mostly okay. Not perfect, but okay. Fall was harvest time, and it was all hands on deck. Even the smallest children helped, carrying corn from the fields to the village, spreading it out to dry on the rooftops. There would be a harvest celebration, with dancing and feasting, and probably a little bit of corn beer, which was a thing they made, and which apparently tasted about as good as you'd expect fermented corn to taste. And then winter again, and the whole cycle starting over. The village next door, about 5 miles down the canyon, there was another village. Similar size, similar setup, built into a different cliff face. The two villages were friendly. They traded with each other, sometimes intermarried, definitely gossiped about each other. If one village had a bad harvest, the other would share. If one village needed help with a big construction project, people from the other would come help. There was a trade network that extended far beyond just these two villages. Shell beads from the Pacific coast, copper bells from Mexico, turquoise from mines 100 miles away. These items would show up in the village, traded hand to hand through a network of relationships that spanned hundreds of miles. But the trade was slow, casual. It wasn't about profit or building wealth. It was about maintaining relationships, about having something beautiful or exotic to show your neighbors. The villages also shared resources in a very practical way. There were areas where everyone could gather wild plants, places where anyone could hunt rabbits or deer if they could catch them. No one owned the land in the way we think of ownership. You could use it. Your family could farm a particular field for generations, but it belonged to everyone in a broader sense. Why this matters for falling asleep, I know. This probably seems incredibly mundane. Guy wakes up, tends corn, eats corn, goes to sleep. Repeat for an entire lifetime. But that's kind of the point, right? This was life for most of human history. Not battles and plagues and dramatic betrayals, but just the quiet work of staying alive and trying to be comfortable and hopefully passing something on to your kids. These people in Segi Canyon lived and died without ever knowing that 800 years later, someone would be talking about them on the internet to help people fall asleep. They didn't build monuments to themselves. They didn't write their names in stone. They just lived as peacefully as they could manage in a beautiful place. And honestly, there's something deeply calming about that. Knowing that for most of human existence, most people were just doing their thing, growing their food, raising their kids, making their pottery pretty, because why not? The big dramatic events of history happened, sure, but they happened around and sometimes to these quiet villages, and the villages just kept going. So let's keep going too, because there are a lot more peaceful villages to visit tonight, and we've got all the time in the world. The mound builders and their extremely organized gardens. Let's drift east now, all the way across what we call New Mexico and Texas, over the plains, and into the Mississippi River Valley. Around the same time those cliff dwellers were tending their corn in Arizona, there were people here building something completely different. Not cities, exactly, but not tiny villages either. Somewhere in between. These were the Mississippian culture people, and they're famous for building mounds. Big earthen mounds, some of them massive. But tonight, we're not talking about the massive ceremonial centers like Cahokia. We're talking about the smaller villages, the ones scattered along the river tributaries, where people lived quiet lives and occasionally had to contribute labor to building a mound, which was probably about as fun as it sounds. A village called will never know what there was a village along a creek that fed into the Mississippi, somewhere in what's now southern Illinois. Maybe 200 people lived there, in houses arranged in a loose cluster around a central plaza. The houses were rectangular, built with a framework of wooden posts set into the ground, walls made of woven mats and daubed with mud, and thatched roofs that needed replacing every few years when they started to leak. Each house had a fire pit in the center, storage pits dug into the floor for keeping corn and beans dry, and sleeping platforms along the walls. The platforms were raised up a bit to keep you off the cold ground, and they were covered with woven mats and animal hides. Honestly, not the worst sleeping arrangement in medieval history. The village had one mound, not a huge one, maybe 15 feet high. It had taken the whole village several years to build, hauling basket after basket of dirt and packing it down. On top of the mound was a building where the village chief lived and where important ceremonies happened. The chief was a guy who'd inherited the position from his mother's brother, because this society traced descent through the mother's line, which actually made a lot of sense when you think about it. You always know who someone's mother is. The chief, who mostly just organized things, the chief's name is lost to time. So let's call him he who sits on the mound, because that was basically his job description. He wasn't a warrior king or anything dramatic. His main responsibilities were organizing community labor, mediating disputes, hosting visitors from other villages, and making sure the ceremonies happened at the right times. He who sits on the mound would wake up in his house on top of the mound, which sounds fancy, but was basically just a larger version of everyone else's house with better ventilation. His wife would already be up, starting a fire, putting on water to boil for some kind of herbal tea situation that people drank in the mornings. Breakfast was corn porridge. Again, corn was huge here too, along with beans and squash. But the Mississippi Valley had better soil and more reliable rain than the Southwest, so harvests were generally pretty good. They also hunted and fished a lot more. Deer, turkey, fish from the creek, freshwater mussels that they collected by the thousands. Hidden heaps, which are basically ancient garbage dumps, are full of mussel shells. People must have eaten mussels constantly. After breakfast, he who sits on the mound would descend from his mound, which sounds more dignified than it was since the path was just packed dirt that got slippery when it rained, and make his rounds through the village. Check in with various families, see how the planting was going. Listen to someone complain about their neighbor's dog getting into their corn. Dogs, by the way, were everywhere. They were small, kind of fox-like, and they ate table scraps and probably helped with hunting sometimes. They also barked at strangers, which was useful in a society where surprise visitors could be either traders with cool stuff or raiders looking for trouble. Though in this particular village, In this particular time, raiders weren't really an issue. Everyone around here got along reasonably well. The gardens that fed everyone the fields were down by the creek, in the rich bottomland that flooded every spring and left behind fresh soil. The flooding was predictable enough that people built their houses on slightly higher ground and just accepted that their fields would be underwater for a few weeks every year. When the water receded, they'd plant. But here's what's interesting. These weren't just fields. They were incredibly organized gardens. Each family had their own plot, and within that plot, they'd plant in this very specific way. Corn in small hills, beans climbing the corn stalks, squash spreading between the hills. But they also planted sunflowers for the seeds, marsh elder for its oily seeds, and little berry bushes around the edges. The gardens were beautiful in a functional sort of way. Everything had its place, and everything was maintained with this obsessive attention to detail. Weeds were pulled daily. The soil was loosened around each plant. When the corn grew tall, the stalks were checked for pests and diseases. There was a woman in the village, let's call her she who knows the plants, who was basically the agricultural expert. She'd inherited knowledge from her grandmother about which plants liked to grow together, which ones needed more water, how to tell when the soil was too tired and needed to rest for a season. She'd walk through the gardens giving advice, and people actually listened to her because everyone had seen what happened when someone ignored her advice and their corn all died. Pottery as social currency in the afternoons, when it was too hot to work in the gardens, people would retreat to the shade and work on crafts. The women mostly made pottery, which was essential because you needed pots for cooking, storing food, carrying water, and about 1 million other things. But the pottery here was different from the Southwest. It was tempered with crushed shells instead of sand, which gave it a different texture. And the designs were more elaborate. People would carve patterns into the wet clay before firing, or paint designs on after. There were specific styles that were popular in this village, patterns that everyone recognized as coming from here. When a girl from this village married a boy from another village 5 miles upriver, she'd bring her pottery with her, and people in the new village could look at it and say, "Oh, she's from that village by the creek." The pottery was like a calling card, a way of carrying your home with you. And pottery was also how you maintained social relationships. If your neighbor helped you build a new house, you'd give them a nice pot as a thank you. If you wanted to smooth things over after an argument, a pot was a good peace offering. The really elaborate pots, the ones with intricate designs and perfect symmetry, those were for special occasions. Marriages, naming ceremonies, funerals. The rhythm of the river life here was dictated by the river, and the seasons even more than in the Southwest. Spring was flood season, which meant staying in the village and working on indoor tasks while the water rose and covered the fields. People would fish from canoes, catching whatever was swimming around in the high water. When the floods receded, it was all hands on deck for planting. The whole village would be out in the fields from sunrise to sunset, getting everything planted while the soil was still moist and perfect. It It was exhausting, but it was also social. People would work side by side, talking, singing work songs, complaining about their backs. Summer was maintenance, and also the season for traveling. The chief would organize trading expeditions to other villages, sometimes traveling for weeks to exchange goods. They'd bring surplus corn, dried fish, nice pottery, and come back with marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes region, stone for tools from quarries hundreds of miles away. But most people didn't travel. Most people stayed in the village and tended their gardens and went about their daily routines. The travelers would come back with stories about other villages, other people, exotic foods they'd tried. And everyone would listen and wonder what it was like out there, but not wonder enough to actually go themselves because, honestly, home was pretty good. The social life of a very small community evenings were the best time. The whole village would gather in the central plaza after dinner. Kids would play, running around in packs like kids do everywhere. The adults would sit and talk, working on small tasks, sharpening tools, weaving, repairing things that had broken during the day. There was a lot of gossip. Who was courting who? Whose corn was doing suspiciously well? Were they using some kind of secret technique or just lucky? That one guy who never helped with community projects, but always showed up when there was food being shared. The family that was planning to move to a different village because they had relatives there. Stories were important here too. The old people would tell about the ancestors, about how the village was founded, about the time there was a terrible drought. And everyone had to move for a few years, but then came back. About the great flood that was even worse than the usual spring floods. About the chief 3 generations ago who could supposedly talk to animals, though honestly that story had probably gotten exaggerated over the years. Music was a thing. People made flutes from bird bones and hollowed out reeds. They made drums from hollowed logs with deer hide stretched across. They made rattles from gourds filled with seeds. During ceremonies, the music could go on for hours. This rhythmic, repetitive sound that probably put people into a trance state. But most evenings, it was just someone softly playing a flute while the sun went down. Death and memory. When someone died, the whole village mourned. The body would be wrapped in woven mats and buried in a cemetery area outside the village, usually with some pottery, tools, maybe some food for the journey to wherever dead people went. There would be a ceremony that lasted several days, with feasting and music and storytelling about the deceased. But then life went on. It had to. The corn still needed tending. The children still needed feeding. The pottery still needed making. Death was sad, but it was also just part of the cycle. People were born, grew up, had children of their own, grew old, and died. The village continued. Some people got special burials. Chiefs were buried in the mounds sometimes, with elaborate grave goods. People who'd been particularly important or beloved might get buried with more stuff, more ceremony. But mostly, people were just laid to rest in a simple grave with a few belongings. And eventually, the living forgot exactly where that grave was, and it all became part of the earth again. The long, peaceful stretch, Here's what's remarkable about this village and villages like it. They existed for generations, sometimes centuries, without any major upheavals. No invasions, no civil wars, no catastrophic diseases. Just the steady rhythm of planting and harvest, birth and death, the slow accumulation of small improvements and innovations. Someone figured out a better way to weave mats, and that technique spread through the village, and then to neighboring villages. Someone developed a new pottery design, and it became popular. Someone noticed that if you planted your corn in a slightly different pattern, you got better yields, and soon everyone was doing it that way. Changes happened, but they happened slowly, incrementally, in a way that didn't disrupt the basic pattern of life. And that basic pattern was peaceful. Not perfect. There were still accidents and illnesses and interpersonal conflicts and bad harvest years, but peaceful in the sense that people generally felt safe, could plan for the future, could raise their children with a reasonable expectation that those children would grow up to live similar lives. The women who ran everything, let's be honest, about who was actually running things in this village. The chief organized stuff and hosted ceremonies, sure. But the real power was with the elder women, the grandmothers who'd lived through enough seasons to know everything worth knowing. There was a council of elder women who met regularly to make decisions about important stuff. When to plant, what to do about a family that was causing problems, whether to accept a marriage proposal from another village, how to allocate resources during a tough year. The chief would listen to them and then announce their decisions as if they were his own, and everyone understood how this worked and was fine with it. The elder women also controlled the knowledge. They knew which plants were medicinal, how to deliver babies, how to treat injuries and illnesses. They taught the younger women, passing down this enormous body of practical knowledge that kept everyone alive and healthy. Well, as healthy as people could be in the 1100s, which admittedly wasn't that healthy by modern standards, but they did their best. When a young woman got married, the elder women would give her advice. Some of it was about practical stuff, like how to manage a household and deal with in-laws. Some of it was probably relationship advice that hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Communication is important. Don't go to bed angry. Sometimes you just have to let the small stuff go. The kids who were just kids, the children in the village, had responsibilities, sure. Even little kids had to help with age-appropriate tasks. Carrying water, scaring birds away from the crops, helping with harvests. But they also had time to just be kids. They played games. They made toys from sticks and corn husks and clay. They swam in the creek in summer, probably when they were supposed to be doing chores. They climbed trees and caught frogs and dared each other to do mildly dangerous things. The older kids would watch the younger ones, and everyone kept an eye on everybody else's children because it took a village, literally. If a kid was being a brat, any adult could correct them, and the parents wouldn't get offended because that's just how things worked. Community raising of children. Education was informal but thorough. Kids learned by watching and helping. A boy would follow his father or uncle to the fields and learn how to plant and tend crops. A girl would help her mother with pottery and cooking and learn those skills. Everyone learned the stories, the songs, the ceremonies. By the time you were an adult, you knew everything you needed to know to be a functioning member of the village. The fishermen of the northern coasts. Now let's drift even further, up the Mississippi, and then east through the Great Lakes region, all the way to the northeastern coast. Different landscape entirely. Dense forests, rocky shores, cold winters that would make those southwestern cliff dwellers weep. Around 1200 CE, there were villages dotted along the coast and rivers of what we now call Maine, New Hampshire, the maritime provinces of Canada. These were Wabanaki people, though that's a term that encompasses several different groups: Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, and others. Each had their own territory, their own villages, their own way of doing things. Let's visit a village at the mouth of a river. Maybe 50 people living in wigwams scattered along the riverbank in a loose cluster. The wigwams were dome-shaped structures built with a frame of bent saplings covered with birch bark. Birch bark is amazing stuff, by the way. Waterproof, flexible, easy to work with. People used it for everything, covering houses, making containers, making canoes. The village that moved with the seasons. Here's the thing about this village. It wasn't permanent in the way the cliff dwellings or the mound builder villages were. This was a summer village, occupied from late spring through early fall. When winter came, the people would pack up and move inland to winter camps in the forest, where there was more shelter from the coastal storms and better hunting. This seasonal movement was just normal life. You didn't stay in one place all year because one place couldn't give you everything you needed. The coast was perfect in summer: abundant fish, shellfish, seabirds, seal. The forest was better in winter: deer, moose, protection from wind. So in late May, families would arrive at the summer village. They'd repair or rebuild their wigwams, which had been left standing but needed maintenance after the winter. They'd check their fishing weirs, which were these ingenious traps built from sticks and rocks that funneled fish into enclosures where you could easily catch them. They'd gather supplies and tools they'd cached here the previous fall. And then they'd settle into the summer routine. The fish that never stopped coming the main activity in summer was fishing. The river had runs of salmon, alewives, sturgeon, shad. They'd come upriver to spawn in these enormous numbers that sound made up, but apparently weren't. The old stories talk about being able to walk across a river on the backs of fish, which is probably an exaggeration, but probably not much of one. Men would go out in canoes, these beautiful lightweight birch bark canoes that could navigate shallow water and be carried overland when necessary. They'd use spears, nets, hooks made from bone or wood. A good fisherman could catch enough fish in a morning to feed his family for days. The women would process the fish. Some got eaten fresh, roasted over fires, or boiled in birch bark containers with hot stones. Some got smoked on racks over slow fires, which preserved them for weeks. Some got dried in the sun. By the end of summer, every family had stores of dried and smoked fish would help get them through the winter. There was also shellfish, clams, oysters, mussels. People would dig them at low tide, collecting them in baskets. The shells got piled up into middens that grew year after year, generation after generation. Some of those shell middens are massive, visible landmarks on the coast, even today. Thousands of years after the last shell was tossed onto the pile. The elder who remembered everything, there was an old man in this village, probably in his 60s, which was genuinely ancient for this time and place. Let's call him he who has seen many summers. He'd been coming to this exact spot on the river for his entire life, and his father before him, and his grandfather before that. He who has seen many summers knew things. He knew where the best fishing spots were, and when different fish species would arrive. He knew which berries were safe to eat, and which would make you sick. He knew the stories of the land, could point to places, and tell you what happened there generations ago. He knew the weather signs, what kind of clouds meant a storm was coming, what the behavior of birds could tell you about the season ahead. He'd sit in front of his wigwam in the afternoons, working on small tasks, making fish hooks from bone, repairing tools, weaving baskets from spruce roots. Kids would hang around him because he told good stories, and sometimes gave them little treats, like dried berries or small pieces of maple sugar that someone had traded from inland. His stories were part history, part instruction manual for living. He'd talk about the time a huge storm destroyed half the village and what people did to survive. About the year the fish didn't come, and everyone had to rely on hunting and stored food. About the neighboring village that had a dispute with them 30 years ago, and how the elders worked it out peacefully. He was also, honestly, kind of funny. He'd tell stories about his own youth and make himself look foolish, which the kids loved. Like the time he was trying to impress a girl and fell out of his canoe into freezing water. Or the time he got lost in the forest for 3 days because he wasn't paying attention to the trail markers. He'd laugh at himself, and everyone would laugh with him. And through the laughter, lessons got taught. Women's work that required incredible skill. The women in this village were constantly busy with work that required years of training to do well. Making birch bark containers, for instance. You had to harvest the bark at the right time of year when it peeled off easily. You had to know how to fold and stitch it without splitting it. You had to waterproof the seams with spruce resin. These containers were essential. People used them for cooking. You'd fill a bark container with water and food, then drop in hot stones from the fire to boil it. They used them for storage, for gathering berries and roots, for carrying water. A woman who made good containers was valuable to the whole community. There was also hide tanning, which was incredibly labor-intensive. After the men hunted a deer or moose, the women would scrape the hide to remove all the flesh and fat. Then they'd soak it in a mixture of water and the animal's brain, yes, brain tissue, which contains oils that help soften the leather. Then they'd stretch and work the hide for days, literally days, until it was soft and pliable. One deer hide could take a week of work, but the results were worth it. The leather was used for clothing, moccasins, bags, bindings. It was warm, durable, and if made well, could last for years. The kids who learned by doing children in this village had a different childhood than the Mississippian kids. Here, kids were expected to start contributing to food gathering at a young age. Little kids would go clamming with their mothers, learning to spot the signs of clams buried in the sand and mud. They'd gather berries, help with processing fish, collect firewood. By the time a boy was 8 or 9, he'd be going out in the canoes, learning to paddle, learning to fish. It was practical education, but it was also dangerous. The ocean was cold, the currents were strong, and if you fell out of a canoe far from shore, you could be in real trouble. So kids learned to respect the water, to pay attention, to follow the instructions of the adults. Girls learned by helping their mothers and aunts with all the domestic work, making containers, tanning hides, processing food, caring for younger siblings. It was work, sure, but it was also social. The women would work together, talking and laughing and teaching, and the girls would absorb both the practical skills and the social dynamics. There was also time for play. Kids would swim in the river in summer, though they were warned about currents and cold water. They'd play games, make toys from bark and sticks, tell each other stories they'd heard from the elders. They'd dare each other to do slightly scary things, like climbing high trees or exploring further into the forest than they were supposed to. The quiet spirituality of everything religion here wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into everything. Before fishing, you'd make an offering to the river. After killing a deer, you'd thank its spirit. When harvesting bark or plants, you'd ask permission and only take what you needed. There were ceremonies for important events. When the first salmon arrived in spring, there was a ceremony to honor them and ensure they'd keep coming back. When someone died, there were ceremonies to help their spirit journey to the afterlife. When kids reached certain ages, there were coming-of-age ceremonies that marked their transition to new responsibilities. But mostly, spirituality was quiet and personal. People would go alone into the forest to pray or seek visions. They'd make small offerings at special places, a waterfall, a distinctive rock formation, a particularly old tree. They'd tell stories about the spirits and beings that inhabited the landscape, and those stories were part entertainment, part moral instruction, part spiritual teaching. There wasn't a priest class or religious hierarchy. The elders led ceremonies because they knew how, having learned from previous elders. Everyone participated. Everyone had a role. It was communal and egalitarian in a way that feels almost modern. Trading and traveling, even though this village was pretty remote by modern standards, people traveled and traded regularly. In summer, men would take canoes and paddle along the coast or up rivers to visit other villages. They'd trade dried fish for corn that inland villages grew, or for furs from people who lived in better hunting territory. They'd trade their excellent birch bark work for stone tools from quarries they didn't have access to. These trading trips were also social visits. You'd stay with relatives or friends in other villages, catch up on news, arrange marriages between families. Young people especially liked these trips because it gave them a chance to meet potential partners from outside their own small village. Marrying someone from your own village wasn't forbidden exactly, but it wasn't ideal either. Fresh blood, fresh connections to other communities, that was valued. Women sometimes traveled too, though less far. They'd visit neighboring villages to see family, to trade specialized goods like particularly well-made containers or clothing, or to attend important ceremonies. When a woman married into another village, she'd maintain ties with her birth village, visiting regularly and keeping those family connections strong. The trails between villages were well maintained. People would clear fallen trees, mark confusing spots, create landmarks. There were traditional camping spots along longer routes, places where generations of travelers had stopped for the night. At these spots, you might find fire rings, lean-to shelters, sometimes cached supplies that were communal property. Anyone could use them if needed, and you were expected to replace what you took. The food that wasn't fish, although fish, was the main summer protein. People ate a lot of other stuff too. In the forest behind the village, there were berries, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries. Women and children would spend days gathering them, eating some fresh and drying the rest for winter. They'd also gather nuts in the fall: acorns, hickory nuts, chestnuts. These required processing to be edible, but they were high in calories and kept well. There were also wild plants that people harvested for food or medicine. Fiddlehead ferns in spring, which tasted good and were one of the first fresh greens available after winter. Wild onions and leeks, roots of various plants that could be cooked or dried. The knowledge of which plants were useful and how to process them was extensive and impressive. People hunted, but hunting was more of a fall and winter activity when they were inland. In summer at the coast, there were seals occasionally, and people would hunt seabirds and collect their eggs from nesting colonies on rocky islands. But mostly, summer was about fish and gathering. One interesting thing they made was a kind of bread from ground acorns or cattail roots mixed with berries, and formed into cakes that were cooked on hot stones. It probably didn't taste like modern bread at all, but it was filling and portable, good for traveling. The long summer evenings, because they were so far north, summer meant very long days. The sun wouldn't set until late, and even then there was twilight for hours. People would work late into the evening because there was light to work by, and then gather around fires as darkness finally came. The fires were social centers. People would sit around them, talking quietly, telling stories, working on small tasks that didn't require much light. Sometimes someone would play a drum or a flute. Sometimes people would sing these long, repetitive songs that probably had religious significance, but were also just nice to listen to. The kids would eventually fall asleep right there by the fire, and parents would carry them to the wigwams. The adults would stay up later, enjoying the warmth and the company. There was a quality to these evening gatherings that's hard to describe: peaceful, communal, unhurried. No one was checking their phone or worried about getting up for work the next morning. Time moved differently. When summer ended around September, people would start preparing to leave. The fish runs were over. The weather was getting colder. The first frost would come soon. Families would take down what they wanted to carry inland and cache the rest. The wigwam frames would be left standing. The fishing weirs would be left in the river. The canoes would be hidden in the forest, covered with brush to protect them from weather. Then, carrying what they needed on their backs, and in canoes, families would head inland to their winter camps. The summer village would be empty and quiet, waiting for the next spring when people would return, and the whole cycle would start again. This migration was work, but it was also anticipated. Winter camps had their own rhythms and pleasures. Better hunting, different plants, a different kind of community life. People who'd spent all summer fishing would get to do different work. Kids who'd spent summer playing by the river would get to play in the snow. And through it all, the slow accumulation of knowledge and tradition continued. Each generation learned from the previous one, added their own small innovations, and passed it on to the next. The cycle of seasons, the cycle of life, continuing in patterns that had been established long before anyone could remember. The Great Lakes villages and their enormous gardens. Let's move inland now to the Great Lakes region. Around 1300 CE, there were villages here that combined the best of different worlds, fishing like the coastal people, farming like the Mississippians, hunting in the vast forests that surrounded the lakes. One village sat on a bluff overlooking Lake Huron. Maybe 300 people lived here, in longhouses arranged in neat rows with pathways between them. Longhouses were the preferred architecture in this region, long rectangular buildings that could house multiple families, each with their own fire pit along the central corridor. The longhouses were built with a framework of wooden poles covered with elm bark that was stripped from trees in large sheets. Each longhouse might be 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, housing up to 10 families. That's a lot of people sharing one building. But it worked because everyone had their own designated space, and there were social rules about respecting privacy, even when actual privacy was impossible. The Iroquoian way of doing things, this village was Iroquoian, though the specific tribal identity is less important than understanding how they lived. What's striking about these villages is how organized they were. The longhouses were arranged in rows, with wide streets between them. There were communal areas for ceremonies and meetings. The whole village was often surrounded by a palisade wall, though this particular village didn't have one because there hadn't been any conflicts in this area for years. Outside the village were the fields, extensive fields of corn, beans, and squash, worked by the women according to a system that had been refined over generations. The fields here were bigger than anything we've talked about so far, acres and acres of carefully tended crops. This was serious agriculture, producing surpluses that could feed the village through long winters and even be traded to other communities. The women did all the farming. This wasn't because men were lazy. They had their own work, primarily hunting and fishing and defense if it was needed. farming was women's domain, and they were extremely good at it. They had developed varieties of corn that grew well in this climate, beans that produced abundantly, squash that stored well through winter. A woman named She Who Plants Well. There was a woman in this village, maybe 40 years old, who was known as an exceptional farmer. Her section of the communal fields always had the best yields. People would watch what she did and try to copy her techniques. She Who Plants Well would wake up early in her section of the longhouse, stepping carefully over still sleeping family members to get to the door. Outside, the morning air would be cool and fresh, the lake visible in the distance, mist rising from its surface. Breakfast was simple leftover corn soup from the night before, maybe some dried berries. Then she'd walk to the fields, which were about a quarter mile from the village. The walk was pleasant in good weather, less so in rain, but it gave her time to think about what needed to be done that day. Her section of the field was organized with almost geometric precision. Rows of corn hills, each one the perfect distance from the next. As the corn grew, beans would climb the stalks, and squash would spread between the rows, creating this layered ecosystem where each plant helped the others. She'd spend the morning working, pulling weeds, checking for pests, loosening soil around the plants. It was repetitive work, the kind where your hands moved automatically and your mind wandered. She'd think about her daughters, whether they were learning the skills they needed, about her son who was off on a hunting trip, about her husband who'd been having back pain lately, about the roof of the longhouse, which needed some repairs before winter. Around midday, she'd rest in the shade at the edge of the field. Other women would be there too, and they'd talk. Gossip about village happenings, advice about children or husbands or in-laws, discussions about farming techniques. Someone would share food, corn cakes, dried fish, fresh berries. It was social time disguised as lunch break. The politics of the longhouse, living in a longhouse with multiple families, meant constant negotiation. The longhouse was controlled by a clan mother, an older woman who'd earned respect through her wisdom and fairness. She'd mediate disputes, make decisions about the use of communal resources, and generally keep everyone from killing each other. Because disputes happened. Someone's kids were too noisy. Someone wasn't doing their share of maintaining the building. Someone's fire was smoking too much and bothering the neighbors. Someone took food from the communal stores without asking. The clan mother would handle these with a combination of common sense, traditional wisdom, and occasionally just telling people to stop being ridiculous and work it out themselves. She had authority, but it was based on respect and tradition rather than any kind of force. If people thought she was being unfair, they could complain to the village council, though this rarely happened because clan mothers were generally chosen specifically for their good judgment. The longhouse was also the main social unit for the village. Each longhouse was associated with a specific clan: Bear Clan, Wolf Clan, Turtle Clan, and so on. You were born into your mother's clan and remained in it for life. When you married, if you were a man, you'd move into your wife's longhouse. If you were a woman, your husband would move into yours. This matrilineal matrilocal system meant that the core of each longhouse was a group of related women, sisters, mothers, daughters, aunts, nieces, who'd lived together their whole lives. The men married in from other longhouses, so they were always sort of outsiders in their own homes, which honestly sounds awkward, but apparently worked fine. The men who hunted and fished while the women farmed. The men hunted and fished. In summer, they'd fish in the lake, going out in canoes to catch whitefish, sturgeon, pike. They'd use nets, spears, hooks. A good day of fishing could bring in enough to feed multiple families. Hunting was mostly a fall and winter activity, though men would go on short hunting trips throughout the year if opportunities arose. Deer were the main target, but also bear, elk, smaller game like rabbits and birds. Hunting required different skills than farming: patience, tracking, knowledge of animal behavior, the ability to stay very quiet and very still for long periods. There was a young man in the village, maybe 20 years old, who was becoming known as a skilled hunter. Let's call him he who walks quietly. He'd learned from his uncles and the other men of his wife's longhouse, spending years developing his skills. A typical hunting trip would last several days. He who walks quietly would leave the village with a few other men, carrying bows and arrows, knives, supplies for camping. They'd travel into the forest, sometimes 10 or 15 miles from the village, to where the deer were more plentiful. They'd make a temporary camp and then spend days hunting. Long hours of walking quietly through the forest, reading signs, tracks, droppings, broken branches where deer had passed. Waiting in strategic spots, hoping a deer would come by. When someone did manage to kill a deer, the whole hunting party would help process it, dividing the meat according to who needed it most and who'd helped with the kill. The journey back to the village was harder because now they were carrying heavy loads of meat. But there was also satisfaction, knowing they were bringing home food that would be appreciated and shared. The children who played and learned kids in this village had a lot of freedom. They'd run around in packs, playing games, exploring the area around the village, getting into minor trouble. The longhouses were full of cousins and siblings, so there were always other kids to play with. Little kids would play near the village, watched by whoever was around. Older kids would range further, going down to the lake to swim, into the forest to climb trees and look for bird nests, to the fields to help a bit, but mostly to goof off. Boys and girls played together when they were young, but as they got older, they'd start splitting up more. Boys would spend more time with men, learning to hunt and fish and make tools. Girls would spend more time with women, learning farming and cooking and all the skills they'd need as adults. But there was also formal education. Elders would teach groups of children about history, about proper behavior, about spiritual matters. They'd tell the creation stories, the stories of the ancestors, the stories that explained why things were the way they were. Kids were expected to memorize these stories exactly, because they'd need to pass them on to the next generation. The surplus and what it meant the agriculture here was productive enough that the village produced surpluses. Extra corn, beans, dried squash. This surplus meant a few important things. First, it meant the village could support people who weren't directly producing food. Skilled craftspeople, people who made particularly good pottery or baskets or tools, could spend more time on their craft. Elders who were too old to work hard physically could still contribute by teaching and advising. People who were sick or injured could be cared for without the family starving. Second, it meant the village could trade. Surplus corn could be traded to neighboring villages for furs, or to coastal villages for dried fish and shells, or to villages in different areas for stone or copper or other materials. This trading network connected villages across hundreds of miles, creating relationships and mutual dependencies that helped maintain peace. Third, it meant the village could have ceremonies and feasts without worrying about running out of food. There was a wedding or a funeral or a seasonal ceremony. Everyone could eat well. There was corn soup in huge pots, roasted meat, cornbread, berries, maple sugar treats. The abundance of food at these events was both practical, people needed to eat, and symbolic, demonstrating the prosperity and generosity of the community. The winter that wasn't terrible winter in the Great Lakes region was serious business. Snow measured in feet, temperatures well below freezing for months, lakes frozen solid. But the village was prepared. The longhouses, while not exactly cozy by modern standards, were relatively warm. Each family's fire pit provided heat, and with all those people in one building, body heat added up. The bark walls and roofs kept out most of the wind and snow, though they definitely leaked in places, and everyone just accepted that winter meant being a bit cold and damp sometimes. Food stores were adequate. The harvest had been good, and each longhouse had corn, beans, and dried squash stored in special areas built into the structure. There was dried fish, smoked meat, maple sugar, dried berries. Carefully rationed, these stores would last until spring. People spent more time indoors in winter, which meant more time for crafts and socializing. Men would make tools, repair equipment, carve decorative items. Women would weave, make clothing from hides, work on pottery and baskets. Kids would play inside, though they'd also bundle up and go out to play in the snow when it wasn't actively storming. Storytelling was especially important in winter. The long, dark evenings were perfect for it. Elders would tell stories for hours, and everyone would listen, working on their crafts with their hands, while their minds traveled to the time of the ancestors, to the spirit world, to faraway places they'd never seen. The democracy of decisions when important decisions needed to be made. Should the village move to a new location? Should they agree to a proposed marriage alliance with another village? How should they handle a dispute with neighbors? The village would hold a council. The council was open to everyone, though in practice, the people who spoke were usually clan mothers, chiefs, and respected elders. These weren't elected positions exactly, but people who'd proven themselves wise and capable over many years. Someone who gave bad advice repeatedly would stop being listened to, while someone who consistently showed good judgment would gain influence. Decisions were made by consensus. The council would meet, sometimes for days, discussing an issue from every angle. People would speak, others would respond, arguments would be made and countered. Eventually, either consensus would emerge or the issue would be tabled for more thought. This sounds incredibly slow and frustrating by modern standards, and it probably was sometimes. But it also meant that when a decision was made, everyone had bought into it. There was no angry minority who'd been outvoted and were now resentful. Everyone had been heard, everyone's concerns had been addressed, and the final decision reflected the will of the community. There was a chief, a man who held a leadership position, but his power was more ceremonial and diplomatic than autocratic. He'd represent the village in dealings with other villages, lead certain ceremonies, maybe organize group projects like building a new longhouse or clearing new fields. But he couldn't make major decisions alone. He needed the support of the clan mothers and the consensus of the community. The peaceful resolution of everything. What's remarkable about this village, and others like it, is how rarely violence was used to resolve disputes. When conflicts arose, and they did, because people are people, there were established ways to handle them. If two individuals had a dispute, they'd first try to work it out themselves. If that didn't work, they'd bring in the clan mother or another respected elder to mediate. The mediator would hear both sides, ask questions, try to get to the root of the problem. Often the solution involved one or both parties making some kind of restitution or apology. If the dispute was between families or clans, it would go to the village council. The same process, hearing all sides, seeking understanding, working toward a resolution that everyone could live with. Sometimes this meant compensation. Sometimes it meant changes in behavior. Sometimes it just meant everyone agreeing to let it go and move on. Disputes between villages were handled with even more formality. Villages would send representatives to meet, often with neutral villages mediating. There were elaborate diplomatic protocols, gift-giving, speeches, shared meals. The goal was always to find a peaceful resolution and maintain the relationships that connected communities across the region. Violence wasn't impossible. If someone committed a serious crime like murder, there could be violent retaliation from the victim's family. But this was seen as a last resort and a failure of the normal systems. Most of the time, most disputes were resolved through talk, negotiation, and mutual agreement. The River Valley farmers of the Midwest. Let's drift westward now, to the river valleys of what's now the Midwest, the Missouri, the Kansas, the Platte Rivers, and their tributaries. Around 1400 CE, there were farming villages here that were thriving in this landscape of rivers and prairies. One village sat on a terrace above a river bend. About 100 people lived here, in earth lodges scattered across the terrace, in a loose pattern that suggested organic growth over decades. Each earth lodge housed one extended family: grandparents, parents, children, sometimes married children with their own kids. The earth lodges were impressive structures, circular, maybe 40 feet across, with a central fire pit and a hole in the roof for smoke to escape. The frame was made of cottonwood posts and beams, covered with willow branches, prairie grass, and then a thick layer of earth. From a distance, the village probably looked like a collection of grassy mounds. Inside an earth lodge, let's step inside one of these lodges. The entrance was a covered passageway that angled into the main room, designed to keep wind from blowing directly onto the fire. Once inside, your eyes would need to adjust to the dim light coming from the smoke hole and the fire. The interior was organized in a circle around the central fire pit. Each family unit had their own section of the circle, delineated more by custom than by any physical barrier. There would be raised sleeping platforms, storage areas, workspaces. Personal belongings would hang from the wooden framework: clothing, tools, bags of seeds, dried herbs. The fire was the center of everything. It provided heat, light, a place to cook. Someone was responsible for keeping it going all the time, banking it at night so it could easily be restarted in the morning. Going to bed with a fire and waking up with only cold ashes was a sign of poor household management. The earth lodge was warm in winter and cool in summer. The thick earth walls provided excellent insulation. In the hottest part of summer, people would often sleep outside on the roof, which was flat and covered with grass, making it comfortable enough for sleeping mats. The woman who managed everything each earth lodge had a primary woman, usually the oldest capable woman in the family, who managed the household. Let's call her she who keeps the lodge. She was responsible for organizing work, managing food stores, mediating family disputes, and generally keeping everything running smoothly. She who keeps the lodge would wake up early, before most of the family. She'd check the fire, maybe add a few sticks to get it burning brighter. She'd start water heating for morning tea made from herbs and roots. As family members woke up, she'd assign tasks for the day. Her daughters and daughters-in-law would help with cooking and household work. Breakfast was usually corn porridge, yes, again, sometimes with dried berries, or a bit of honey if they had it. The men and boys would eat and then head out to their work. The women and girls would begin their tasks. The work was seasonal but relentless. In spring, there were fields to prepare and plant. Summer meant tending crops, gathering wild plants, processing foods for storage. Fall was harvest time, followed by intensive preservation work. Winter was for crafts, repairs, and indoor tasks. But she who keeps the lodge also had to think long-term. How much corn did they have stored, and would it last until next harvest? Who in the family needed new clothing or moccasins? When should they slaughter one of their few chickens for a special meal? Should they trade some of their surplus corn for bison hides from the hunting peoples who lived further west on the plains? The gardens by the river, the village's gardens, were down closer to the river, in the rich bottomland that flooded every spring and stayed moist through the growing season. Each family had their own plot, passed down through the female line. A woman inherited her mother's garden plot and would pass it to her daughters. The gardens were intensively managed. Corn was the primary crop, but there were also beans, squash, sunflowers, tobacco for ceremonial use, and various other plants. Women had developed varieties specifically adapted to this region: corn, matured quickly enough to beat the first frost. Beans that could handle the hot, dry periods that sometimes hit in late summer. Weeding was constant work. The rich soil that made these gardens so productive also meant weeds grew enthusiastically. Women and girls would spend hours bent over in the gardens, pulling weeds, loosening soil, checking each plant's health. There was also the constant battle with pests and wildlife. Birds loved the ripening corn. Raccoons and deer would raid the gardens if they could. Women would build scarecrows, fence the gardens with brush, sometimes sleep out in small shelters during the crucial ripening period to scare off nighttime raiders. But the work paid off. These gardens produced abundantly. A good year meant enough corn to feed the family, some to store as insurance against bad years, and surplus to trade. The trade was important. It brought in bison hides, obsidian from the Rockies, shells from the Gulf, exotic foods and materials from far away places. The men who hunted bison while women managed the gardens. Men spent much of their time hunting. The main target was bison, which migrated through the region in huge herds. A successful bison hunt could provide enough meat to feed the whole village for weeks, plus hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread. Hunting bison on foot, with bows and arrows or spears, was dangerous and difficult. The men from this village weren't primarily hunters. They were farmers who hunted, so they didn't have the specialized skills of the plains peoples who followed the herds year-round. But they developed their own techniques. Sometimes they'd dig pits and drive small groups of bison into them. Sometimes they'd use fire to direct bison toward waiting hunters. Sometimes they'd just track a herd patiently and wait for an opportunity to get close enough for a shot. There was a man in the village, maybe 30 years old, who was considered an excellent hunter. He who runs with bison had a talent for understanding bison behavior, for predicting where they'd move, for getting close without spooking them. When he led a hunting party, they almost always came back with meat. But even he who runs with bison couldn't guarantee success. Hunting was uncertain. Some trips produced nothing despite days of effort. Some years, the bison herds didn't come through the area at all. This uncertainty was why the gardens were so important. They were reliable in a way hunting wasn't. The trade network that connected everything this village was part of a trade network that extended from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Northern Plains. It was an informal network, not controlled by any central authority, just individual relationships between villages and families that had been maintained for generations. Traders would arrive at the village occasionally, carrying goods from far away. They'd be welcomed, fed, given a place to sleep. Then the trading would begin, but it wasn't like a modern transaction. It was a social event, full of ceremony and gift giving and storytelling. The traders would display their goods: marine shells, copper ornaments, exotic stone, fine pottery from distant villages. The village families would bring out things they had to trade: surplus corn, finished hides, locally made pottery and tools. But before any trading happened, there would be feasting and conversation. exchange of news from far away. The actual trading was understated. Someone would admire a shell necklace. The trader would offer it as a gift. Later, the person would reciprocate with a gift of corn or a nice hide, perhaps slightly more valuable than the necklace, establishing their generosity. Back and forth it would go, with both parties trying to appear generous rather than calculating. This system worked because reputation mattered. A trader who was stingy or dishonest wouldn't be welcomed back. A village that didn't reciprocate appropriately would find traders going elsewhere. So everyone had incentive to be fair and generous, which meant the system functioned pretty well. The ceremonies that marked time life in this village was structured around ceremonies. There were small daily ceremonies, offering tobacco smoke to the spirits before eating, prayers at sunrise, nighttime rituals before sleep. And there were larger ceremonies that marked important transitions and seasonal changes. In spring, there was a ceremony to bless the seeds before planting. Everyone would gather in the center of the village. The spiritual leader, an older man who'd inherited his role and spent years learning the proper rituals, would make offerings and prayers. People would bring their seed corn, which had been carefully selected and saved from last year's best plants, to be blessed. Then the planting would begin, and there was a collective sense that they'd done everything right, honored the spirits and the ancestors, and now the corn would grow as it should. Summer had ceremonies too. When the corn was knee-high, there would be a ceremony to encourage growth. When the first corn ripened, there would be a ceremony of thanksgiving. These weren't separate from daily life. They were woven into it, marking the rhythm of the agricultural year. Fall harvest ceremonies were the biggest. When the corn was in and stored, the village would feast for days. There would be dancing and singing, games and competitions, storytelling. Young people would flirt and make plans to marry. Families would reaffirm their connections. It was part religious ceremony, part celebration, part social bonding that helped the community survive another winter together. The winter of long stories winter in this region was cold, but not as brutal as the Great Lakes. The earth lodges were comfortable enough. Families would gather around their fires, doing indoor work, women weaving and sewing, men making tools and weapons, children playing quiet games. The long, dark evenings were for stories. The old people would tell about the creation of the world, about the ancestors who first came to this place, about the spirits and beings that inhabited the landscape. They'd tell moral tales about people who were greedy or lazy or cruel and came to bad ends, and about people who were generous and hardworking and kind and were rewarded. They'd also tell family stories about Grandma's grandmother, who was famous for her pottery, about the great flood 3 generations ago that destroyed half the village, about the time a young man went on a vision quest and came back with important knowledge that changed how the village did things. These stories weren't entertainment exactly, though they were entertaining. They were how knowledge and values were transmitted. They were how the community understood itself, its history, its place in the world. Every time a story was told, it reinforced the bonds between the listeners, reminded them who they were and where they came from. coastal villages of the Pacific Northwest. Now, let's travel across the entire continent, all the way to the Pacific coast. The villages here were different from anything we've seen so far. The people didn't farm. They didn't need to. The ocean and rivers provided so much food that agriculture would have been a waste of time. Around 1200 CE, there was a village at the mouth of a river in what's now Northern California. Maybe 100 people lived here, in plank houses arranged in a line along the riverbank. The houses were made from split cedar planks, fitted together so precisely that they were nearly waterproof, with pitched roofs to shed the constant rain. The wealth of the ocean, these people had access to an almost ridiculous abundance of food. Salmon ran up the river in such numbers that you could catch them with your hands if you were patient. The ocean had halibut, cod, rockfish. The tide pools had mussels, clams, sea urchins, edible seaweed. The forests had deer, elk, berries, nuts. This abundance meant people had time for things other than just surviving. They developed elaborate art, complex social structures, sophisticated spiritual practices. They also developed something that looks a lot like social classes, which was unusual for pre-contact American societies. There were high-status families and low-status families. High-status people owned the best fishing spots, the best hunting territories, had the most elaborate houses. Low-status people did more of the hard labor and had fewer privileges. This wasn't quite slavery, but it also wasn't the egalitarian social structure we've seen in other villages. But let's focus on a typical family, somewhere in the middle of the social hierarchy. Not elite, not at the bottom, just regular people making their way. Inside a cedar plank house, the family lived in a house that was maybe 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, shared with 2 other related families. The house had a central fire pit where cooking happened and where people gathered. Around the edges were sleeping platforms, raised off the ground and covered with woven mats and furs. The walls were thick cedar planks that could be removed in good weather to let in light and air. The floor was hard packed earth covered with more cedar planks in the main living area. Everything smelled like cedar and wood smoke, which was actually pretty pleasant. Storage was important. Family had boxes made from bent cedar bark, waterproofed with fish oil, where they kept dried salmon, smoked halibut, dried berries, rendered seal fat. These stores had to last through the winter when fishing was less productive and foraging was limited. The house also contained the family's wealth: carved wooden bowls and spoons, woven baskets so tightly made they could hold water, blankets woven from cedar bark and dog hair, ceremonial masks carved from wood and painted with mineral pigments. These items weren't just useful, they were art, and they represented the family's status and connections. The man who knew the river, there was a man in this family, maybe 45 years old, who was an expert fisherman. He who understands salmon had spent his entire life learning the river, the tides, the behavior of different fish species at different times of year. He'd wake before dawn during salmon season, which was the most important time of the year. He'd check his nets, which which were stretched across sections of the river on wooden frames. The nets were made from plant fibers, painstakingly twisted and knotted by his wife and sisters. Making a good fishing net could take months of work. When he pulled in the nets, there would often be dozens of salmon. Big ones, 20 or 30 pounds each. He'd kill them quickly and efficiently, then carry them back to the house where the women would begin processing them. But fishing wasn't just about technique. It was also spiritual. Before the first salmon run of the season, there would be a ceremony to honor the salmon spirits and ensure they would return next year. He who understands salmon would participate in this ceremony, making offerings, singing the proper songs, showing respect for the fish that gave their lives to feed his family. He believed, genuinely believed, that the salmon chose to give themselves to people who treated them with respect. If you were greedy, if you wasted fish, if you didn't perform the proper ceremonies, the salmon would stop coming. So he was always careful, always respectful, always grateful. The women who made everything beautiful, the women in this family, did constant work, but much of it was creative. They made baskets with patterns so complex it hurts your eyes to look at them. They wove blankets with designs that told stories. They prepared food in ways that were both practical and aesthetically pleasing. The main woman of the family, she who weaves well, was known throughout the village for her baskets. She could weave a basket so tightly it would hold water without leaking. She could create geometric patterns in different colors by using different types of plant fibers. Her baskets were given as gifts at important ceremonies, traded to other villages, passed down to her daughters. Weaving a basket started with gathering materials. Certain plants had to be harvested at certain times of year when the fibers were just right. They had to be processed, split, soaked, dried, sometimes dyed with plant materials to create different colors. Then came the actual weaving, which required incredible patience and precision. She who weaves well would sit outside her house on good days, or inside by the fire when it rained, weaving for hours. Her hands moved automatically, creating patterns she'd learned from her mother and grandmother. While she worked, she'd talk with other women, tell stories to children, think about everything and nothing. The baskets she made were functional, used for gathering, storing, cooking. But they were also beautiful, and that beauty mattered. Why make an ugly basket when you could make a beautiful one? Why not add pleasure to daily life through the things you made and used? The potlatch and social obligations. This culture had an institution called the potlatch, which was basically a massive feast and gift-giving ceremony. When someone wanted to mark an important occasion, a wedding, a funeral, a coming of age, the completion of a new house, they'd host a potlatch. The host family would spend months or even years preparing. They'd accumulate surplus food, make or trade for valuable items to give away, practice the songs and dances that would be performed. Then they'd invite people from their own village and neighboring villages. The potlatch would last for days. There would be feasting on salmon, seal meat, berries, all kinds of delicacies. There would be dancing and singing and storytelling. And then there would be gift giving, with the host family giving away enormous amounts of stuff, blankets, baskets, carved items, even canoes. This seems crazy from a modern perspective. Why work for years to accumulate wealth and then give it all away? But in this society, giving things away increased your status. It demonstrated that you were so wealthy you could afford to be generous. It created social obligations. People who received gifts would be expected to reciprocate eventually, and to speak well of the host family. The family we're following would attend potlatches hosted by others, receiving gifts and enjoying the feasting. They'd also be saving and planning for when they'd host their own potlatch to mark their son's coming of age. It was a constant cycle of giving and receiving that bound the community together. The art that surrounded everything art wasn't separate from life in this village. Everything was decorated. Canoes had carved prows. Houses had painted designs on the support posts. Storage boxes had elaborate carved and painted decorations. Even everyday items like spoons and bowls were carved with designs. The designs weren't random. They represented family crests, spiritual beings, stories from mythology. A family's crest might be a raven, or a killer whale, or a thunderbird. This crest would appear on their house, their canoes, their ceremonial items. It identified them, told others who they were, and which lineage they belonged to. There were specialists in the village who did the most elaborate carving and painting. They'd learned their skills over years, studying under masters. When someone wanted a particularly important item made, a ceremonial mask, a house post, a memorial pole, they'd commission one of these specialists and pay them well. But even ordinary people decorated the items they made. A woman making a basket would add a pattern. A man carving a spoon would add a small design. The village was full of beautiful objects, used daily, slowly wearing out and being replaced with new beautiful objects. The seasons of abundance, spring, was herring season. The herring would come close to shore to spawn, and people would harvest them in enormous quantities. Some were eaten fresh, some were dried, some were rendered for their oil, which was a delicacy and a trade good. Summer was salmon season. This was the most important time of year, when families had to catch and process enough salmon to last through the winter. It was exhausting work, but also social. Everyone would be working at the fishing sites, and there was a party atmosphere despite the long hours. Fall was berry season, and time to hunt land animals for their hides and meat before winter set in. All was also when potlatches often happened, because families had just accumulated all their summer harvest and could afford to be generous. Winter was the ceremonial season. The days were short and the weather was terrible, so people stayed inside more. This was when the big ceremonies happened, when masks came out and dances were performed, when spiritual matters took center stage. The ceremonies could go on for days, with elaborate costumes and performances that had been passed down through generations. The peace of abundance, when you have enough food. A lot of potential conflicts just don't arise. This village and its neighbors weren't fighting over scarce resources, because resources weren't that scarce. Yes, there were disputes over fishing rights and territorial boundaries, but these were usually handled through negotiation and social pressure. The social hierarchy created its own tensions. Sure, lower status families probably resented higher status ones sometimes, but the system included mechanisms for social mobility. If a lower status person was particularly skilled or lucky, they could work their way up. If a high status person was lazy or unlucky, their family might slide down. And everyone, regardless of status, participated in the same ceremonies, told the same stories, identified with the same community. The bonds of shared culture and kinship were strong enough to prevent conflicts from escalating beyond verbal disputes and hurt feelings. The woodland villages of the East, let's drift back east now, to the deciduous forests that covered much of what's now the eastern United States. Around 1100 CE, there were small villages scattered through these woodlands, living in a landscape of enormous trees, abundant game, and reliable rainfall. One village sat on a rise above a small river, surrounded by forest. Maybe 40 people lived here, in houses that were simple but comfortable. The houses were round or oval, built with a frame of bent saplings covered with bark or woven mats. Each housed one nuclear family, parents and children. The forest that provided everything the forest here was old growth, never cleared, and it was incredibly productive. Oak trees produced acorns that could be gathered by the bushel. Hickory trees dropped nuts that were rich in oil and calories. Chestnut trees, which are basically extinct now due to blight, were abundant, and their nuts were a staple food. There were also berries, greens, roots, medicinal plants. A person who knew the forest could gather food year-round, supplementing what they grew in their gardens with wild foods that required no labor beyond collecting. The village had gardens, but they were small. The women would clear a patch of forest by girdling trees, cutting through the bark all the way around so the tree would die and let light through, and then plant corn, beans, and squash among the dead trees. After a few years, when the soil was depleted, they'd move the garden to a new spot and let the old one regenerate. This slash and burn agriculture sounds destructive, but it actually worked well in this context. The forest could recover, and the small population meant there was always more forest to use. The gardens produced enough to supplement wild foods, but weren't the primary food source. A woman who knew every plant there was an older woman in the village, probably in her 50s, who knew more about useful plants than anyone. She who knows the forest had spent her entire life learning from her mother and grandmother and adding her own observations and experiments. She knew which plants would cure which illnesses. Willow bark for pain and fever, certain roots for stomach troubles, leaves that could be made into a tea for coughs. She knew which plants were edible and when they were best to harvest. She knew which could be used for dyes, for basket making, for tools and weapons. People would come to her when they were sick or injured. She'd make them teas, poultices, preparations that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, but at least demonstrated care and effort. She understood that a lot of healing was about the patient believing they'd be cared for, about the community gathering around someone who was suffering. She'd also teach younger women, passing on her knowledge in the same way it had been passed to her. She'd take them into the forest and show them plants, explain when and how to harvest them, how to prepare them, what they were good for. Some of the information was practical, some was spiritual, and the line between the two was blurry. The hunters who knew patience, the men in this village, were primarily hunters. The forest had white-tailed deer, which were the main source of meat and hides. There were also turkey, passenger pigeons in enormous flocks, rabbits, squirrels, and occasionally larger game like bear or elk. Hunting deer required incredible patience and skill. A hunter would move through the forest silently, reading signs, tracks, droppings, rubs where deer had scraped their antlers on trees. He'd find a promising spot and wait, sometimes for hours, barely breathing, until a deer came within range. The bow and arrows they used were simple but effective. The bow was made from carefully selected wood, probably hickory or ash, worked over months to get the right curve and pull. The arrows were made from straight shoots, fletched with turkey feathers, tipped with stone points that had been carefully napped into shape. When a hunter killed a deer, he'd say prayers to its spirit, thanking it for giving its life. He believed, genuinely, that the deer had chosen to die for him. If he was disrespectful, if he wasted meat, the deer spirits would stop allowing themselves to be killed, and he'd have no luck hunting. After the kill came the work of processing. The deer would be gutted in the field, the useful organs saved, the rest left for scavengers. Then the carcass would be carried back to the village, where the women would take over. They'd skin it, scrape the hide, butcher the meat, save the sinew for thread, crack the bones for marrow. Nothing was wasted. The village of kin, everyone in this village was related. It was founded by two brothers and their families a generation ago. And since then, the population had grown through births, and a few people marrying in from neighboring villages. This meant everyone knew everyone's business, which could be annoying, but also meant strong social support. If a family had a bad hunting season, others would share. If someone was sick, the whole village would help care for them and their children. If there was a big project, like building a new house or clearing a new garden plot, everyone would pitch in. But close kinship also meant you had to be careful about conflicts. You couldn't just avoid someone you didn't get along with, you had to see them every day. So people developed skills in conflict avoidance and resolution. There was a lot of gentle teasing that let you express frustration without actual confrontation. There was a lot of just letting things go. The village didn't have formal leaders. Decisions were made by consensus, with older people and people who'd proven their wisdom having more influence. If there was a dispute, the involved parties would talk it through, maybe with an elder mediating. The goal was always to reach a solution everyone could live with. The seasonal round life here followed a predictable pattern. Spring was a hungry time, when winter stores were running low and fresh food wasn't abundant yet. People would eat a lot of fish from the river, early greens, whatever they'd stored that was still edible. Summer was easier. The gardens produced, wild berries ripened, young animals were plentiful. People would work hard gathering and preserving food, but there was also time to relax, to play, to visit other villages. Fall was was nut gathering season. The whole village would spend weeks collecting acorns, hickory nuts, chestnuts. These would be processed. The acorns had to be leached to remove bitter tannins and stored in underground pits lined with bark to keep them dry. Fall was also hunting season. The deer were fat from summer feeding, and their hides were prime for making winter clothing. Successful hunters were celebrated, and their families would have status through the winter. Winter was quiet. People stayed close to their houses, doing indoor work, telling stories, sleeping a lot, because what else was there to do when it was cold and dark? The village would get pretty smelly by late winter, everyone living in close quarters, wearing the same leather clothing for months, bathing only occasionally in cold water. Spring meant a chance to air everything out, wash, feel clean again. The spirits in everything religion here was animistic. Everything had a spirit: animals, plants, rocks, rivers, storms. People would make offerings to these spirits, ask for their help or protection, thank them when things went well. There were also more powerful spirits, supernatural beings that featured in stories, and sometimes appeared in dreams or visions. These beings weren't gods exactly, but they were dangerous and powerful, and needed to be approached with respect. Young people, especially young men, would sometimes go on vision quests, spending days alone in the forest fasting and seeking a vision from the spirit world. If they had a powerful vision, they might gain spiritual power that would help them throughout their lives. If they didn't, well, they'd tried, and that still meant something. The line between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. Dreams were significant, omens were everywhere, and coincidences had meaning. A hunter who saw a white deer might interpret it as a sign from the spirits. A woman whose garden failed might wonder what she'd done to offend the spirits of that place. This could be burdensome, constantly worrying about spiritual matters, trying to maintain right relationships with all these beings and forces. But it also meant the world was alive, meaningful, full of possibility and connection. The children of the forest kids here had an almost idyllic childhood by some measures. They were loved and valued, rarely punished harshly, given lots of freedom to explore and play. The forest was their playground, and they learned its paths and secrets intimately. Little kids would follow their parents around, helping with small tasks, learning by watching and imitating. By the time they were 6 or 7, they'd be contributing meaningfully, gathering firewood, carrying water, helping with food preparation. Boys would start going on hunting trips with the men around age 10, learning to move quietly, track animals, shoot accurately. It took years to become a good hunter, and everyone understood that kids would make mistakes and scare off game. It was part of learning. Girls would learn domestic skills from their mothers and aunts, preparing food, making clothing, processing hides, identifying useful plants. They'd also learn the social skills they'd need as adults, how to maintain relationships, how to handle conflicts, how to raise children. But there was also play. Kids would make toys from sticks and bark and bones. They'd play games that probably haven't changed much: tag, hide and seek, made up games with rules that changed constantly. They'd swim in the river in summer, slide down snowy hills in winter, climb trees year-round. The piece of isolation this village was somewhat isolated. Other villages existed, of course, scattered through the forest, but they were far enough away that you didn't see people from them unless you specifically traveled to visit. This isolation contributed to peace. You can't fight with neighbors you never see. When people did visit from other villages, it was a big event. The visitors would be fed, entertained, given gifts. There would be feasting and storytelling and updates on what was happening in different areas. Young people would flirt with new faces. Marriages might be arranged. These visits maintained connections that could be important. If your village had a bad year, you might be able to stay with relatives in another village temporarily. If you needed something specific, a particular type of stone for tools, or a medicinal plant that didn't grow near you, you could trade for it through these networks. But mostly, life happened within the village itself. The same faces day after day, year after year. The same paths through the forest, the same fishing spots in the river, the same stories told over and over. It could be boring, probably was boring sometimes, but it was also stable and predictable in a way that felt safe. The island dwellers of the Caribbean. Let's take one more journey, this time south to the Caribbean islands. Around 1300 CE, there were villages on islands throughout the Caribbean, living in a tropical paradise that seems almost unreal from our modern perspective. One village was on a beach on an island in what's now the Bahamas. Maybe 60 people lived here, in houses made from palm fronds and other plant materials, arranged in a loose cluster around a central plaza. The houses were simple, open-walled structures because you didn't need protection from cold, just sun and rain. The island paradise that was actually work from a modern tourist perspective. Living on a Caribbean beach sounds amazing. Crystal clear water, white sand, perfect weather. But it was also challenging. Fresh water could be scarce on small islands. Hurricanes were a constant threat. The soil was often poor for farming, but these people had adapted. They'd found springs and knew how to collect and store rainwater. They'd learned which plants could tolerate the salt and sandy soil. They developed warning signs for hurricanes and knew where to shelter when storms came. The ocean provided abundant food. Fish, shellfish, sea turtles, lobsters, all were available if you knew how to catch them. The people of this village were expert fishermen and swimmers, comfortable in the water from early childhood. There was a man in the village, maybe 30 years old, who spent most of his time fishing. He who swims like a fish was known for his ability to dive deep and hold his breath for a surprisingly long time. He'd swim down to the reef, spear fish, collect lobsters from their hiding places, gather conchs from the sandy bottom. The water was warm and clear, and swimming in it was pleasant, but it was also work. The ocean had sharks, stinging jellyfish, sharp coral that could cut you. The current could be dangerous. You had to know what you were doing and stay alert. The women who made cassava bread, the staple food on the island, was cassava, a root vegetable that grew reasonably well in the poor soil. But cassava required extensive processing to be edible. It contains cyanide compounds that have to be removed or you'll get sick. The women of the village had perfected this process over generations. They'd grate the cassava roots, which was hard work that left your arms aching. Then they'd squeeze out the poisonous juice using woven baskets designed for this purpose. The juice would be carefully disposed of where no one would accidentally drink it. The remaining cassava pulp would be dried and then made into flat bread cooked on hot stones. The bread was filling, if not particularly exciting, and it stored well, which was important on an island where food preservation was challenging in the heat and humidity. There was a woman in the village, she who makes the best bread, who had a reputation for producing cassava bread that was somehow lighter and more pleasant than others made. Her secret was probably just patience and attention to detail, making sure the cassava was grated finely enough, dried completely, cooked at exactly the right temperature. But people swore her bread was special, and she took pride in that. The canoes that connected islands, the village had several canoes, carved from large trees that grew on bigger islands. These weren't the birch bark canoes of the north, or the plank canoes of the Pacific Northwest. These were dugout canoes, made from a single log that had been shaped by fire and stone tools. Making a canoe was a major undertaking that could take months. You'd select the right tree, fell it, hollow it out gradually by controlled burning and scraping. The canoe had to be balanced, watertight, stable enough to handle ocean swells. The canoes allowed people to travel between islands, to fish in deeper water, to trade with other villages. The men would paddle out into the ocean, sometimes traveling for hours to reach another island or a particularly good fishing spot. These journeys were routine, but also always a bit risky. The weather could change suddenly. Swells could capsize a canoe. You could get lost if you weren't paying attention to landmarks and currents. But the canoes also meant the village wasn't isolated. People would visit relatives on other islands, attend ceremonies at larger settlements, trade for things their island didn't produce. A network of relationships connected villages across dozens of islands, maintained through these regular canoe voyages. The hurricane season everyone dreaded from June through November was hurricane season, and everyone was tense during these months. The sky would be watched constantly for signs of approaching storms. When a hurricane was coming, you could tell from the clouds, the wind direction, the behavior of birds and fish. The village would prepare. The canoes would be dragged far up the beach and secured. Food would be moved to protected spots. People would reinforce their houses, or, if a really bad storm was coming, abandon them entirely and shelter in caves or the most protected areas inland. Then the hurricane would hit, and it would be terrifying. Wind that could blow down trees, rain so heavy you couldn't see, storm surge that could flood the entire beach. People would huddle in whatever shelter they'd found, listening to the wind howl, praying to their gods for protection, waiting for it to be over. After the storm, there would be damage to assess and repair. Houses would need rebuilding. Gardens would be destroyed and need replanting. Sometimes people would be injured or killed. Sometimes canoes would be lost despite all efforts to secure them. The village would come together to help those who'd been hit hardest, sharing food and labor to get everyone back on their feet. But then there would be months until the next hurricane season, and people would mostly forget how frightening it had been and go back to enjoying the pleasant weather and beautiful beaches. The spirits of sea and storm religion here was focused on the forces that most affected life: the ocean, the weather, the cycles of fish and turtle migrations. There were ceremonies to honor the sea spirits, to ask for calm weather and good fishing, to give thanks when people returned safely from ocean voyages. There were also ceremonies for important life events. When a child was born, there would be a naming ceremony. When young people reached adulthood, there were initiation rituals. When someone died, there were funeral ceremonies that involved the whole village. The dead were sometimes buried beneath house floors, sometimes in special cemetery areas. Important people might be buried with grave goods, pottery, tools, ornaments made from shells. The belief was that the dead journeyed to another realm where they'd need these things. But the dead weren't gone entirely. They remained present as ancestors who could help or harm the living, depending on how they were treated. People would make offerings to ancestors, ask for their guidance, tell stories about them to keep their memory alive. The children who lived in water kids in this village grew up amphibious. They learned to swim almost as soon as they could walk and spent huge amounts of time in the water. They'd play in the shallows, swim out to the reef as they got older, dive for shells and small fish. This was partly practical. Swimming was an essential skill in an island community, but it was also just fun. The ocean was an enormous playground, always changing, full of interesting things to discover. Little kids would splash in the tide pools, chasing small fish, collecting shells, getting comfortable with water. Older kids would swim farther out, compete to see who could dive deepest or hold their breath longest, practice spearfishing in shallow water. Girls and boys both swam, though as they got older, there might be more separation, with boys focusing on fishing skills and girls on gathering shellfish and seaweed. But everyone was comfortable in the water in a way that would seem remarkable to most mainland communities. The trade goods that came from far away, despite being on a relatively small island, the village had access to trade goods from surprisingly far away. There were stone tools made from materials that didn't exist on their island, pottery in styles that suggested origins in larger islands or even the mainland, exotic shells that came from different ocean environments. The trade network connected islands throughout the Caribbean and extended to the mainland. Canoe voyages of hundreds of miles weren't uncommon for dedicated traders. They'd travel from island to island, trading surplus fish for cassava, shells for stone tools, information about fishing spots for pottery. The village would sometimes host traders from distant islands. These were major social events. The traders would be fed and entertained, given a place to sleep, asked endless questions about their travels. What were other islands like? What was happening in the wider world? What new stories or songs had they learned? In return for hospitality, the traders would share news and stories, and of course, there would be trading. The village might trade dried fish or shells for something they needed, better stone for tools, pottery from a famous production center, exotic foods or materials. The paradise that required constant work from our perspective, living on a tropical island sounds idyllic. And in some ways it was. The weather was pleasant most of the year. The ocean provided abundant food. The beaches were beautiful. But it was also hard work. Maintaining a cassava garden in poor soil required constant effort. Fishing and gathering shellfish was daily labor. Making and maintaining canoes, houses, tools, all required ongoing work. And always there was the threat of hurricanes that could destroy everything you'd built. But the people here didn't think of their lives as particularly hard. This was just normal life, the way things were. You worked because you had to, but you also had time to relax, to play, to enjoy the beauty around you. The rhythm of work and rest, duty and pleasure, was balanced in a way that made life sustainable. Evenings were social. The whole village would gather in the plaza as the sun set, the temperature finally cooling a bit. People would sit and talk, work on crafts, tell stories. Kids would play until they dropped from exhaustion. The stars would come out, brilliant in the dark sky, and someone might point out constellations and tell the stories associated with them. Then people would drift off to their houses, sleep through the warm night, and wake up to do it all again.